Thank you for joining us. The Premier will begin opening remarks. Reminder to reporters to hit *1 to queue up for questions. When the Q&A begins, you'll have one question and one follow-up. Begin with the Premier.
Great. Thanks very much, George, and good to see you today. We're standing on the lawns of the Legislative Assembly in the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nation. And I wanted to just give an update with my colleague, Finance Minister Carole James, about where we are in recovery, where we are with respect to the pandemic and the impact on British Columbians, and talk to you a little bit about the engagement process we have planned for the days and weeks and months ahead. Together, British Columbians have done an extraordinary job in fighting COVID-19. Compared to other jurisdictions in Canada, in North America, and indeed around the world, our outcomes have been outstanding. Despite our best efforts, unfortunately, 168 people have lost their lives. Those are loved ones that families will not see again, taken by a pandemic that has hit all of us, regardless of where we live, who we are, what our economic status is. It's hit us all very, very hard. But we've been successful because our neighbors and our friends took steps, took personal responsibility, not just for themselves, but for their communities. Many stayed home, many closed their businesses, many stopped going to school, all committed to isolating to ensure that the spread of COVID-19 could stop here. Despite those best efforts, cases continue to persist in Fraser Health and in Vancouver Coastal Health. And Dr. Henry and Minister Dix give regular updates, as you all know, on the status of COVID. And we're here today, Carole and I, to talk about the sacrifices that British Columbians have made to reduce health risks throughout the pandemic, and to talk instead about where we go from here. Back in March, Carole and I announced a economic or COVID-19 action plan that involved a $5 billion financial commitment, $3.5 billion to people and businesses during the pandemic, during the time of restrictions on mobility, restrictions on economic activity, and $1.5 billion set aside for stimulus and recovery. Today we're going to talk about how that $1.5 billion will play in the economy over the next number of months. Carole and I have been working tirelessly, as have my colleagues in Cabinet and in government, to reach out to as many people as possible over the past couple of months. We've had over 1,500 outreach sessions involving business, labor, not-for-profits, community leaders, and others across BC. Over 20,000 individuals have been talked to about the challenges of COVID-19 and how we come through this. That started, of course, with an economic recovery task force that Carole and I still meet with regularly. They provided us invaluable ideas at the front end, many of which we have introduced to good effect to help businesses continue through the pandemic, and those during the phase 2 of the restart, helping them ensure that they're keeping their workers safe and their customers safe as well. But as we've been developing these ideas, there's been a gap, and that gap involves British Columbians. So what Carole and I are announcing today is the economic recovery outreach plan that will involve asking British Columbians what they think. How do they fit in the recovery that we all want to see? How do British Columbians participate in that recovery? Where do they see themselves fitting in? And more importantly, how can their family participate in a more meaningful way? So we're asking people to go online and complete an online survey. We're asking people to look at our paper that we put in place there, the values we should be bringing to the recovery. And all British Columbians can participate. Our process will involve virtual town hall meetings that will be conducted by Minister James and I, as well as members of successful through the shutdown because we've worked together. We will be successful in the recovery if we continue on that path. So today I'm excited to talk about what our expectations are for that recovery and how we can involve more British Columbians in that discussion about what they want to see as we go forward. It's critically important, of course, that we continue to have climate change front and center in our mind. We've seen over the past number of months how important it is to look at the economy of the future, not some months from now, but right now. What steps can we take to create good family-supporting jobs that also improve the quality of life for people and ensure that we're doing our job to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and leave a planet safer for future generations. So although the risk of the pandemic has not left us, COVID-19 remains in British Columbia and people have to remain vigilant. We are in a place where we can now start talking about what does the future look like. We want to thank those who went to work during the pandemic, whether they be frontline healthcare workers or working in the grocery store or the pharmacy, going to work to make sure that our families could get the services that they needed to get through this. And now we're asking you to look at those small businesses that shut down and say, how can I go in there and help those individuals, that family business, those workers get through the summer? There are going to be challenges in many sectors, particularly tourism. And of course, next week, Dr. Henry and Minister Dix will be laying out their latest modeling for where we are with respect to the spread of the disease. And I'm hopeful at that time we can move to full implementation of Phase 3 of the recovery plan, which would include more travel throughout British Columbia. But we want to see the results. We want to see the data next week before we make that announcement. So today I'd like to turn the microphone over to Minister James, and she'll give you some more details on the economic recovery strategy that we want all British Columbians to participate from this day on.
Thank you, Premier. As the Premier has outlined, the people of our province have really pulled together in extraordinary ways when it comes to fighting COVID-19. And that hard work has shown itself in the successes we've had as a province in managing this pandemic and in the restart phase that we're in right now. Today is a call for all British Columbians to put that same energy, that same discipline, that same compassion and creativity into economic recovery. We know it's been a struggle for people over this last number of months. Thousands of businesses have closed to be able to do their part, and thousands of people have been out of work. It's too early to be able to calculate the full economic consequences of COVID-19, but we do know that the effect of this pandemic is as bad as any we've ever seen in the history of our province. Unlike previous recessions, this crisis came on suddenly, caused by a health emergency rather than over time within the economy itself. We've had to close many parts of our economy in order to prevent the spread of the virus, to prevent deaths, and to prevent further economic damage. There's also a difference in the way sectors have been impacted. If we look back to the financial crisis of 2008, for example, real estate and financial sectors were impacted. And this time, COVID-19 has hit the service sectors harder than others. Our recovery will also need to look different than other downturns. The effects haven't been the same for everyone. Our province has lost 314,000 jobs since February. And while we did see a little glimmer of hope in the most recent employment numbers, they don't come anywhere close to being able to address the job losses that people are experiencing. As we move forward with economic recovery, it will be important for us to take a look at the magnitude of losses throughout sectors and to look at those who have been most affected. The economic effects are felt differently based on your age, your gender, your income level, and the sector that you work in. By far, the service sector has suffered the most, accounting for 90% of the job losses. A large percentage of those have been in accommodation, food services, and retail trade. And when you look at those sectors, the lowest wage earners have been the hardest hit. The majority of job losses have happened to people who are making at, near minimum wage. That means young people and women have been the most vulnerable. The youth unemployment rate is a staggering 29%. And women make up more than 60% of the job losses in the hardest hit sector. Employment did slightly improve for both men and women in May, but a woman continues to be more likely, by 25%, to have lost their job than a man. And as we know, women are also more likely to be shouldering the greatest caregiving responsibilities for their children and other family members. And let's remember, behind those statistics are people, businesses who are worried about their future and their children's future. Rebuilding our economy after the outbreak is going to be a massive job. But we are starting from a place of strength with a great many advantages. Advantages like our capacity for research, innovation and entrepreneurship, our natural environment and resources, and our geography. We haven't lost those inherent strengths in our province. And through this recovery, we have the opportunity to build on them. And of course, our most important advantage is our people. As we've done from our very first budget in 2017, we're going to remain focused on our priorities. Investing in people, the services that people count on, and a long-term sustainable economy with good jobs in every corner of our province. This pandemic has exposed gaps in our economy and society, and also highlighted areas of critical importance. We've all been reminded during COVID-19 of the need for strong public services and supports, workplace safety, and our collective responsibility to take care of each other. This recovery gives us an opportunity to address gaps, to build on our strengths and more. A recovery plan based on the values we have as British Columbians, taking action on climate change, addressing the rights of Indigenous peoples, addressing inequality, and building a strong, resilient, innovative economy that leaves no one behind will allow us to build back. And this recovery requires everyone to participate. This summer until July 21st, we want people to tell us the barriers and strengths they see and what are their priorities for the province. We've seen a number of topics arise during this pandemic. Discussions on supply chains, the importance of buying local supplies and local procurement. We've been reminded of the importance of technology and its role in businesses retooling and in the ability to work and to learn at home. We've seen just how critical our public services are, how critical they are to our economy, things like childcare, education, transportation. And now we need the people of this province to weigh in. Would people benefit from more skills training or retraining? Is healthcare one of your spending priorities? Is access to childcare holding you back from going back to work? Is growing the tech economy a priority that you have? Do we need to enhance relief programs? Do we need to address long-term gaps in our economy? As the Premier said, we've been working with businesses, labour, not-for-profits, sectors across the board, Indigenous leaders, and ideas are already coming in. This is an opportunity for British Columbians to tell us their ideas, what matters to them over the next 6 weeks of consultation. Despite COVID-19, BC is an economic leader in Canada. By building on our strengths, by drawing on new ideas, we're going to restore economic growth and achieve a vibrant, inclusive, competitive economy. Recovery is going to be a tough task, there's no question. But we are compassionate and capable in British Columbia. And this is an opportunity to build our economic recovery together. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much. First off, for the QA, we have Richard Zussman, Global News. Richard, go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Obviously, as we look towards recovery, there are still a lot of people who are struggling, still a lot of people out of work. Will there be an extension of the BC benefits that have been announced, both the renters benefit and also whether there'll be an additional benefit on top of the BC benefit that was announced that aligns with the CERB?
Thank you for the question, and you're absolutely right. We're far from out from under the challenges that COVID-19 presented for our economy. And as Carole said, a large portion of those workers that were most adversely affected were women and young people. So we're developing programs within government, not just those that are already being delivered based on Budget 2020, but how we can use the $1.5 billion remaining in the COVID-19 action plan to address those issues going forward. We have been working very cooperatively with the federal government. The CERB is a key part of our ability to enhance programs without it all being on the backs of British Columbians. The federal government has been very responsive in that regard. We're going to continue to work work with them to refine our programs so that we can mesh them seamlessly in the months ahead. But we're focusing now on recovery and stimulus. That means the largest infrastructure package that's ever been tabled, the Budget 2020, means jobs in communities right across British Columbia, training opportunities. Carole has a number of other initiatives available to her, and we're going to be trying to mesh those with the programs that are already in place. We don't want any more administrative burdens. We want to maybe make sure we can get dollars into people's hands as quickly as possible. We had early success in that regard, and I think that will carry us through the summer.
Follow-up?
So that means no extension on the BC temporary rental supplement. Like, that will expire at the end of June, and that will be the end?
Minister Robinson is working with stakeholders on a range of issues when it comes to the rental market. It's posed challenges not just for tenants, but for landlords as well, not just individuals, but businesses as well. So there are a host of challenges when it comes to how do we manage the costs of living, the cost of renting space. And it may not be the same program that we have in place now, but we're committed to making sure that people will get the resources they need to get through this.
Next.
Thank you.
Next, we have Binder from CTV. Binder, please go ahead.
Premier, we continue to hear concerns about what happened in some long-term care homes as they responded to the pandemic. Quebec's coroner's office has said they will conduct a public inquiry. I'm wondering, what do you think it might take to restore some of the confidence that may have been lost in the long-term care industry here in British Columbia?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think it's really important that we highlight the diversity of Canada. It's always apparent to those who've traveled across the country, but the situations in long-term care in Quebec and Ontario are not the situations here in British Columbia. We have had outbreaks in long-term care facilities, but we took steps early on in the process to make sure we were protecting the most vulnerable people. I don't believe that an inquiry is the appropriate way forward at this time in British Columbia. I know that Isabel McKenzie, the seniors advocate, will be there to provide advice to government, independent advice to government. The sector has advocates. We work with them all the time. Minister James and I deal with the not-for-profit sector within the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Task Force. So we're going to be continuing to focus on making it better for British Columbians. I'm not convinced that an inquiry is the way to go at this point, but we're open to all suggestions.
Follow-up?
Premier, I just wanted to clarify, you talked about travel within British Columbia. I know you've already opened up some camping within the province. People, we are hearing, are starting to make Airbnb bookings. Do you believe they're offside at this point, or are you okay with that?
Well, I would be, I'm looking at making bookings myself. So I'm optimistic that the British Columbians have worked hard to flatten the curve. Dr. Henry will have more modeling, as I said, next Tuesday, and that will help guide the decisions that Cabinet will make with respect to various orders around travel. I'm very optimistic that the summer is just upon us. It's not yet. It's, in fact, late spring today. It doesn't feel that way here on the lawns of the legislature. It feels like the middle of summer. But there's a good deal of summer ahead of us, and I want to do everything that I can, working with public health, of course, and Dr. Henry to make sure we're not putting anybody at risk. But I'm hopeful, based on the numbers we've seen over the past number of weeks, that we'll be in a position to move to Phase 3 sometime next week.
Next, we have Rob Shaw, Vancouver Sun. Rob, please go ahead.
Oh, hey, Premier. I'd like to get an update from you on BC Ferries. Have you had any success in getting bailout money from Ottawa to assist BC Ferries? And if you can't get that money, are you considering provincial cash on top of the operating contract to prevent the cutbacks on 11 different coastal routes that are being considered by BC Ferries right now?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have raised repeatedly, not in recent weeks, the issues of BC Ferries with the federal government. I have to confess there hasn't been a particularly sympathetic year because British Columbia is the only province that has a significant ferry complement. Our coastal communities, of course, are dependent on the ferry system. Minister James and I are both residents of Vancouver Island, so we understand intimately the importance of our marine highway to British Columbia. It's not just our economy, but our social and cultural life as well. And we are in discussions with BC Ferries. We understand the drastic drop-off in ridership they've had over the past 3 months, and we're going to work with them to find answers to those challenges. But it can't be it can't be done unilaterally by BC Ferries or by the government of British Columbia. We need to have a collaborative approach, and we've been engaged in that over the past number of weeks.
Follow up, Rob?
Well, I'm just looking at some of the routes, and you hear from coastal residents. These are some of the same sailings that were brought back after the 2014 cuts by the previous Liberal government. And I remember in opposition, NDP critics at the time saying they're outrageous cuts. The government has to step in and fund these routes. They're part of the coastal economy. They help people get to medical appointments. They help people get to their jobs. I'm just wondering why your government doesn't kind of see that economic value now that you're in government enough to just put cash on the table to prevent the cuts from happening.
I'm glad I'm not negotiating with you, Rob, but I will say that we do take this very seriously. In all honesty, as an islander, I understand intimately the challenges in coastal communities. We were right in 2014 and we're right today. We're working collaboratively with BC Ferries to find a way forward. We've already made changes to the Coastal Ferry Act to reinsert public interest in the mandate of BC Ferries. We are the lone shareholder of the company, but previous governments made changes to the governance structure, and that has proven to be difficult at this time, but not insurmountable. And I'm confident that we're going to continue to work hard, Minister Trevena, Minister James and I, as well as the executive at BC Ferries, to get an outcome that's in the interest of the people of British Columbia.
Next, we have Lisa Yuzda, News 1130. Lisa, please go ahead.
Hi, Premier. The pandemic has shown how fast, flexible, and creative governments can be, both provincially and provincially working with the federal government to help people under financial duress. So looking at the condo insurance rates that people are seeing, some double, some triple, and hearing yesterday that pretty much what they're getting is more ongoing consultation about what can be done. Why can more not be done right now to help these people who are being crushed by the weight of their increasing insurance, if they can even get it at all?
Lisa, it's Carole. There is no question that people who are in stratas and are seeing the astronomical increases in insurance are looking for supports, and that's understandable. It's unacceptable that we see this kind of crisis in the industry. As you know, government asked the BC Financial Services Authority to take on an initial review of the industry. That was the report that was tabled yesterday, and that report shows very clearly there's a problem in the industry. This is a private sector problem, a private sector industry, but certainly it was made very clear that something needs to occur. So we are working. You will hear from Minister Robinson and myself next week on some short-term areas that we believe will begin to address the issue. As you know, the BC Financial Services Authority is going to continue their work over the summertime and come forward with some more recommendations for government. So exactly as we said, this is a complex issue, but it's unacceptable for the people who are facing these kinds of increases, and we all need to work together, the private sector as well as government, to make sure that we can address the issue on behalf of the people who are stuck in these circumstances.
Lisa, follow-up?
Just slightly different, but similar on people being crushed under the weight of cost. When you're talking about more consultation for what's going to happen with this $1.5 billion, I think it makes some people anxious because they want results now. So is this ongoing consultation on top of what you've done with people in the industry and the 20,000 people the Premier mentioned speaking with, is that going to delay this, or are people going to see some changes right away and then more into the future?
Thank you, Lisa. It's Horgan again. Absolutely not slowing down anything. We're inviting British Columbians to tell us what they think. What I've noticed over the past number of months is that any time I've engaged with anyone, whether they're CEOs, whether they're managing a local restaurant, or they're just people walking down the Galloping Goose, everyone says, how can I help? And I want to take advantage of that. I think our success has been a result of people coming together, recognizing that regardless of where we live, of, regardless of our economic status, people had to take COVID-19 on together as individuals, as a community, and as a province. And so we have been introducing changes to our economy. You've already said so with respect to how fast we've moved on a bunch of issues on the hospitality side. We'll continue to take advice from people and introduce those changes as we get it. But what we are doing today is asking more British Columbians to saying to them, you don't need to sit back. We want to hear from you. We want you to go online and communicate with us what you think the best way forward is for British Columbia. I think it's a great opportunity. I'm excited about it.
Next, we have Shannon Waters, BC Today. Shannon, please go ahead.
Hello, Premier. There's an industry here in BC that says they can play, hopefully, a big role in economic recovery. They're talking about shovel-ready projects. They're talking about millions of dollars in tax revenue, both provincially and federally, but they say they need some help from the province to get there. That's the craft cannabis industry. They've submitted a proposal to both the federal and provincial governments asking for some help in lifting some of these regulations and also some support in meeting things like needed capital costs to get into legal production and things like that. Is craft cannabis on your government's radar when it comes to some of the upcoming spending for economic recovery in the province?
Thank you for the question. And craft cannabis is very much on our agenda and on our radar. It was one of the issues that we were hopeful would have moved more rapidly with the decriminalization and legalization initiatives at the federal level. And we've been making progress. I know Minister Farnworth has been meeting with the craft sector for some time, and now Minister Mungal from Nelson Creston, off a known hotbed for creativity in this sector, is the minister responsible. And I know she's been meeting regularly with the stakeholders, and we're confident we're going to be able to move forward and put British Columbia in that place that, quite frankly, most Canadians expected us to be, and that is national leaders in the development of this sector.
Follow up?
Switching gears just a little bit, we've had a lot of discussion around PPE here in BC. There have been some companies that have expressed interest in retooling manufacturing operations to give BC some domestic supply in items like N95 respirators that have been difficult to come by internationally. Other provinces have invested some money to help these producers cover the cost of that retooling. Ontario so far has dedicated about $50 million to interested manufacturers. Obviously, they have the auto sector out there. Is BC planning on doing something similar, given that while we are acquiring a lot of PPE from international suppliers, we don't seem to have gotten a lot of domestic production going at this point in time?
Thanks for the question. And we have seen an uptick in companies that are diversifying what they can offer to the marketplace. I think of craft brewers, for example, and distillers who have been creating hand sanitizer from their products. And that is a creative way when we saw a downturn in the hospitality sector to focus on providing another product to the marketplace so that people could have solid quality hand sanitizer, which was in short supply, you'll remember, at the front end of the pandemic. Similarly, Harmac in Nanaimo, the pulp and paper, or the pulp mill there, community-owned or employee-owned, has been providing the raw materials to 3M for N95 masks for some time. I've been in discussions with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland about that. She's engaged with Harmac, and we're hopeful that we can see a federal-provincial industry-led initiative that will see more employment in Nanaimo at the mill and more employment in a value-added product coming out from that.
Next, we have Vaughn Palmer. Vaughn, your line is now open.
Good afternoon, Premier. Carole James. In late March, the legislature effectively wrote the government a blank check for $1.5 billion for a recovery action plan. I'm wondering why 3 months later, what we're getting from the government is not some action on how you're going to start spending that with 300,000 people out of work and businesses in bankruptcy, but instead what amounts to a 6-week consultation. I don't see why you're not getting going on the plan itself.
In fact, Vaughn, we've been getting going on exactly where the need has been during COVID. So we started off, you will remember, with health and safety, focusing on the health and safety of British Columbians, making sure we had enough PPEs, making sure we put supports in place, making sure we had the testing equipment. That was our first focus when COVID first struck. The second focus was making sure that we were providing supports to individuals and businesses who are struggling, who were hurting and needed support right then and there. And so that meant putting in place the programs and supports that we put in place. We then opened up for a restart, and that's really the place we're in now. So we're now moving into economic recovery. As the Premier has said, we have had hundreds of ideas coming forward from the thousands of meetings we've been holding with businesses, with sectors, with not-for-profits, with Indigenous groups, with the arts and culture organizations. Now is the opportunity for the public to weigh in. So we continue to make sure that we're going through those proposals that have come in. We want to hear from the public because nobody has a monopoly on good ideas. This is the opportunity for all of the public to engage. And I have to repeat, as the Premier has said, one of our greatest strengths as a province was that we went into fighting COVID together. We did it together. Government, the public, businesses, Labour, First Nations, all together. We were disciplined and we listened to Dr. Henry and we followed the directions. Now we have an opportunity to do the same kind of thing, all together to be able to look at economic recovery and provide that. So that's what this is about, an opportunity for the public to join in, give us their ideas so we can move ahead on economic recovery.
And before you come with your second question, Vaughn, I just add that we have been spending $3.5 billion to this point in time, and we have been preparing to spend the $1.5 billion by the engagement processes that we've been involved in. This is supplementing that in an appropriate way, it seems to me, by asking British Columbians what they think. I'm unapologetic about that, and we're going to continue to make sure that we're putting in place initiatives that people need to get through this. And that's been our objective when Carole and I announced the plan, and that continues to be our objective today.
Follow-up, Vaughn?
Yeah, the $1.5 billion, as I understand it, and we've been told this for a number of weeks, is unspent, and you've been consulting for the better part of 3 months on how to spend it. What you've announced today is another 6 weeks of consultation on it, and I'm just wondering when is public with, as I say, 300,000 people out of work and businesses tottering on the brink of bankruptcy, when is the BC public going to learn what the government has already decided, presumably, or at least learned or proposed, on how to spend the $1.5 billion? Does that mean people are going to have to wait till the end of July or August to hear it?
Well, we've been making announcements regularly, Vaughn, for the past number of weeks, and I think there's agreement across the country that stimulus in a time when you're asking people to stay home is poorly spent resources. And, for example, our Destination BC plan for tourism, domestic tourism this summer, is not well spent if we have not yet come to a place where we can lift travel restrictions. There's a whole host of issues that are governed by the public health information Cabinet receives. We take that information, we make decisions, and we proceed from there. I don't think the way you've characterized it is that this is a 6-week holding period. Quite the contrary. We have a $60 billion plus budget that we tabled in February, which is spending dollars on programs and service delivery across British Columbia. We're working with the federal government to address the extraordinary challenges of unemployment during this period of time, trying to get people back to their old jobs and trying to create new jobs for people who may not be able to go back to the business they used to be in. So although you appear to want to characterize this as a stall, quite the contrary, it's an invitation to regular people to be part of the solution, and I think that's appropriate.
Next, we have April Lawrence, Check News. April, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Premier, so much. Check News ran a story last night about a black man from the United States who is living legally here on Vancouver Island, but has faced racist backlash for having a Washington state license plate. We have since had to pull the story from our website because of more racist backlash. And the man now says he's receiving death threats and is worried for his safety. So first, I'd like to know how you feel about hearing that. And second, what you would say to British Columbians who have been lashing out at people that have license plates from outside our province.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And my immediate response is, I think, the response to the vast, overwhelming majority of British Columbians, and that's to be horrified that people of color would be treated any differently than anyone else in British Columbia. Racism is a scourge, as is COVID-19, and we've been working since we formed government, taking steps to try and address that by returning the Human Rights Commission as not just a symbolic step, but a place where we can address issues like this should the need arise. But these are extraordinary times. I look south of the border. I think it's very difficult to say that we are immune to these activities. I know there's a large rally planned for Vancouver at the end of this week, and I expect British Columbians will turn out in large numbers to have their voices heard on this issue. I encourage them, if they have to show up, to do so in a peaceful manner as they have been doing, and also to be mindful of the consequences to their own health and the health of those around them. But having said that, British Columbia is not the place where racism should find a foothold. I'm committed to making sure that anti-racism programs are put in place. I spoke with the Prime Minister yesterday. He and I had quite a long conversation on a range of issues, but front and center was our commitment from the federal government and the province of British Columbia to not just make statements, but to make absolute changes in how we implement programs and policies, starting with how our education system deals with the systemic racism that has and continues to exist in British Columbia, how the federal government can look at the criminal code to make sure that anti-hate laws are strong enough to get the results that I think all Canadians want to see. It's time for real action, and we're working on that. The story about an individual on Vancouver Island, of all places, to be ridiculed because of the color of his skin and the license plate on the car he drives is unacceptable to me, and I'm absolutely confident the overwhelming majority of British Columbians feel exactly the same way.
Follow-up, April?
Yeah, just more on the license plate. I mean, it's certainly the most extreme case we've heard, but we've heard other stories of people with Alberta license plates or even places elsewhere in Canada having letters left on their car, go home, because of COVID precautions, and people shouldn't be traveling to our province. But we've heard Bonnie Henry say before that, you shouldn't judge someone without hearing their story. What do you say to British Columbians who are rightfully nervous, but who are making judgments when they're seeing those license plates from outside our province?
I think they should take heed of Bonnie's refrain. First and foremost, we need to be kind. Secondly, we need to be calm. And, of course, we need to be safe. But when we do that, these are not just words. These are values that I believe are at the core of who we are as a people, as Canadians. And we live in a dynamic and multicultural community. I'm the son of an Irish immigrant. Indigenous peoples have been here for millennia. The rest of us just showed up, and we're all in this together. There's no space for racism in my world, and there's no space for racism in British Columbia.
Next, we have Keith Baldry. Keith, your line is now open.
Hi, both of you. Thank you very much for doing this. I want to go back to long-term care homes, specifically the issue of access to them for family members. It's an issue that comes up in pretty well every briefing with Dr. Henry and Minister Dix. I'm not asking you to provide a solution here. It's a very challenging situation. But just in terms of put your MLA caps on, how much do you hear about this issue from your constituents? I know my inbox is filled every day with people wanting to know what's going on with access. Is this an issue that you hear a lot from your constituents?
I do, Keith, all the time. In fact, I just spoke with my constituency assistant. We have regular calls each week so he can download what's happening in the community. And the number one issue we're hearing from is people anxious to see loved ones in the latter days of their time here. And these are extraordinarily difficult decisions for Dr. Henry and Minister Dix. I've talked to them both about this repeatedly. They have as much empathy, as you know, as anyone you're going to find. This is not something that they are doing with glee. It's something they're doing because of the vulnerability of the people inside long-term care homes. And we have been successful because we've had a plan to this point in time. And we need to reduce those restrictions. I know that. They know that. The public knows that, but we want to make sure we're doing it in a way that doesn't put anybody at risk. And that's involved additional planning and work that traditionally does not happen in our long-term care facilities. We are already grappling with extraordinary circumstances in those facilities. To add another layer of visitations, which would be in the many thousands, needs to be done in a thoughtful way. And I will defer to Dr. Henry and Minister Dix on this. I know how anguished they are about this, and I know that there's families across British Columbia that are just begging to get to see their loved ones. We hear that, we understand that, but we want to make sure that people are safe.
Follow up, Keith?
Yes, and in terms of the challenges in the long-term care sector, I know Minister Dix has said one of them is staffing, but the other one is capital resources, literally rebuilding some of these homes which are quite old. And I know in your call with the Prime Minister, this issue has come up. I'm just wondering what the status is now in terms of potential federal dollars to go into that sector.
Yeah, thank you for that. We didn't talk about it yesterday. We had a range of other issues, but I have raised it repeatedly with my colleagues. One of the earlier questions asked about the need for an inquiry in the East, in Quebec and Ontario, and I won't speak to those issues. I know they're significant challenges for those communities, but what I do know about the challenges in British Columbia is we need to train more care aides so that we can ensure that we have one person working in one facility. We need to make sure that our outdated facilities are renewed. So in my discussions with the federal government, who are disinclined to talk about operating funds, which is appropriate, they can help us with capital to build new infrastructure, to have new homes. They can help us with creating more spaces in our post-secondary institutions so we can train the people we need to provide the services that are so critically important to long-term care and to health care generally. So I know that the Prime Minister hears me when I say this, and I have to confess that I'm always grateful that it's his job, not mine. British Columbia is challenging enough to add 9 more provinces and 3 territories with multi-languages and regional diversity is an enormous challenge, but I know that long-term care is on the agenda of the federal government. It's just in different places and different paces, depending on where you are in the country. But British Columbia has been clear we need help with capital on infrastructure and help with training spaces for young people to go into the profession.
And last, we have Rob Buffum, CTV. Rob, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much for your time, Premier. My question is, we've been hearing from Victoria hoteliers who are concerned because they've already heard from people in Alberta canceling their travel plans to Victoria. Alberta tourists constitute about 10% of the travelers here and spend 3 times more than British Columbians. I guess my first question is, with phase 3 around the corner next week likely, will the message be to these Albertans who are canceling their trip here because they don't feel welcome? Will the message now be that Albertans or people from other provinces are welcome to come traveling to BC?
Well, firstly, we don't know why people are canceling their reservations. I don't believe it would because they don't feel welcome. I know Albertans are deeply integrated into the communities on the border, whether it be in the Columbia Valley or in the Okanagan, and here on Vancouver Island as well. So it's not about welcoming, it's about concern for public safety. We're hopeful that the modeling that we see next week will allow us to lift internal travel restrictions. And when I say internal, that means within Canada. Dr. Henry and I have been abundantly clear that Canadians have the right to travel within our country. We have never proposed putting up obstacles between Yukon Territory, Alberta, and British Columbia, and quite the contrary. We're very concerned about our international borders, and I'm grateful that the federal government renewed border restrictions until the end of, or near the end of July. But when it comes to British Columbians and Canadians traveling this summer in BC, I'm hopeful that we have record numbers because we're going to need that. And I can't think on a day like today a better place to come. And quite frankly, at this time in June, on a regular year, we wouldn't be able to have a press conference on the front lawn of the legislature because it would be packed with people enjoying the good weather, enjoying the various attractions in Victoria and in the South Island and indeed right around Vancouver Island. So I want to encourage people to take this opportunity, this unique summer, the most unique summer we have ever had as a people, and go and see British Columbia. You'll be amazed that there's not an unlikely place to be in this province. Every corner is spectacular. Every opportunity should be taken while we have that opportunity, and we're not being inundated with international travelers. We can welcome Albertans, people from Manitoba, and people from across the country. Come to British Columbia once we give you the high sign when the health and safety numbers predict that.
Follow-up, Rob?
I guess I'm just wondering, in terms of the $1.5 billion that's been discussed, as I understand it, the surveys and the feedback from the public will be done in about 6 weeks' time. For the tourism industry, that's going to be, well in season. Are there any plans to provide any kind of subsidies or interest-free loans or financial help to that industry that's been hit so hard before those